So, Mr. Ferguson, as I understand it, it took Uber more than a year to disclose this. With them holding that information back so long, how did your office discover this breach?
Yeah, so I think Uber held it for nearly 400 days before they notified our office. So our understanding is new leadership came into Uber, they realized they had the situation, and they decided at that point to come clean with authorities like my office.
And it wasn't just, as I understand it, that they held back the information. Maybe under previous management, there was an active cover-up?
Oh, absolutely. They were aware that somebody had accessed personal information of Uber drivers all across Washington State and across the country, and they essentially paid that person off to keep it quiet. So they knew that Uber drivers had their personal information compromised, failed to tell them, and failed to tell my office.
Now, what do you know about this person who accessed, or as I understand, two of them that accessed the information? Were these people, they weren't acting nefariously, it seems like it was just a matter of seeing whether they could get into the system?
I guess I don't know the details of that. What I know is that Washington State law requires that if a company realizes that the information of an individual has been compromised, they have to notify my office and those individuals within 45 days. That's a law I proposed, legislature a couple years ago, legislature passed. Uber missed that deadline by a long, long ways. And we take that law very seriously, and that's why they're in violation of Washington State law. They failed to notify drivers, failed to notify my office. Their information had been compromised.
So when they did come forward, how much of a mea culpa did they come forward with?
I mean, I'd say a fair amount under new leadership in the office, which we appreciate. That said, the reality is that thousands of Washingtonians, like 13,000 Uber drivers in our state alone, had that information compromised and had no idea that happened for more than a year. That is not appropriate corporate conduct and violates Washington State law, and that's why I filed a lawsuit against them.
Now, this might be out of the purview of your office, but do you know if any of that information that was compromised was used against any of these people?
We don't know for sure. One reason why we're providing about $2.5 million to Uber drivers here in Washington State is because, number one, the stress that Uber drivers must have undoubtedly had when they realized their information was compromised, but also we suspect many would have purchased a credit freeze, for example, or a credit monitoring service once this happened to them, and there's some cost to that. So we want to make sure they're at least made whole from that standpoint, and we think that's the right thing to do for the 13,000 Uber drivers here in Washington State.
So in addition to the monetary settlement, is there anything in it about Uber providing some of that credit monitoring service?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. So this does require what we call injunctive relief. Uber has to change their practices to make sure they're protecting this type of information. They also have to report back to my office periodically on their progress with that so we can monitor how they're doing and making sure that information is protected in the future and that this never happens again.
In the materials I read, it also mentioned that there was some information on tens of millions of Uber riders that might also have been compromised. How does that play into your case?
Yeah, so in Washington State law, there's certain information which, if compromised, triggers the requirement to notify consumers and the state. That did not happen, as far as we understand, for passengers. So from our standpoint, a less serious situation for passengers, therefore the drivers is what we are focused on, because it's their name and their driver's license number that was compromised. That then triggers the requirement to notify my office and those drivers.
Why wasn't it triggered for the riders?
Yeah, I'd have to check with my team. My understanding is there's certain, under state law, certain information, if you trigger a combination of information that then exposes someone to potential problems with having their identity stolen, for example, or their credit card information stolen. That simply did not happen with the passengers, but the potential was there for the drivers because a combination of information was compromised. Once that combination is compromised, then there's a real threat to someone's personal identity or to have funds stolen from their accounts. We want to make sure that doesn't happen.
Well, I guess they could say the riders can say they're very lucky that that didn't get triggered, because that would mean possibly that their credit card or debit card, in a lot of cases, that information would be out there.
That's exactly right. And so that's why I proposed a change to Washington State law a couple years ago. Until that time, there was no deadline by which any entity like Uber would have to notify consumers or the state when a breach like this had happened. That's crazy. Other states have those requirements. We did not. So that's why a couple years ago I asked the legislature, hey, change this law, put that requirement in place. We're glad the legislature followed our advice because we then had the tool to go after Uber and get such a large resolution for Washington State and these 13,000 drivers.
With this being a multi-state situation, is there any sort of federal law that also helps to bolster your case?
We've been doing this under Washington state law, and the reason I proposed that change a couple of years ago was frankly to take Washington state's laws on protections of personal information, which was very backward at that time, one of the least protective states, to make it one of the most aggressive, one of the most protective states for personal information for Washingtonians. We're glad the legislature delivered on that request, and so we still have a ways to go, but no, we did this under Washington state law.
In addition to the monetary settlement that will be doled out to the drivers, is your office making any recommendations to them on how to proceed?
Oh, sorry, in recommendations to?
To the drivers.
Oh, to the drivers. So in terms of getting their dollars from this resolution, we will be tracking them down and locating them. So they don't need to fill out any forms at this point. They don't need to notify my office. That said, if you're an Uber driver in Washington State in 2013 or 2014, if you've changed your address in the last few years, you might want to let my office know. That'll make it easier for us to find you and make sure we get you that check. But otherwise, drivers don't have to do anything personally in terms of notifying my office.
Are you using this also as an opportunity to remind people what they need to do to protect their information?
Yeah, now thankfully under Washington state law, you can get credit freezes for free, for example. It is really important, though, at all times, and that consumers are careful with their personal information, have robust passwords, monitor their checking account, monitor their credit card payments to make sure something isn't happening that is going to harm them. And that takes vigilance, but that's just the reality of the time that we live in. And if folks ever run into a problem, notify my office. This is a good example of the work we can do on behalf of, in this case, 13,000 Washingtonians. So let my office know if you feel you've been hacked, if you feel you've been scammed.
All right, and you had mentioned that Uber has to report back to you pretty regularly.
Yeah.
What kind of information do they need to come back to you with?
They need to show us what they're doing to have greater protections for information, personal information of drivers and passengers. So they have to report back, I think within 2 years, on what that progress is. We'll review that and make sure that they're doing what we think they need to do to make sure they're protecting Washingtonians and their personal information. So for us, it's a combination of, yes, the money is very important, don't get me wrong, that's important, but it's also important that entities change their behavior, change their corporate behavior, so this doesn't happen again, or at least it lessens the likelihood that this could ever happen again.
Well, let's say Uber and its team is not doing enough. What in the minds of you and your team then would happen if they aren't doing a sufficient job?
Well, I don't want to get ahead of it, right? We'll review what they have to say in a couple of years in terms of their changes, but to say that we would take that very seriously, that they need to make these changes, would be an understatement. I also think Uber will try to do right by this. New leadership did come in. They did daylight, frankly, this scandal that they withheld this information for over a year. We take that as a good sign. I mean, I always like it when a target of ours cooperates with our investigation, provides information. That certainly happened here after the new leadership came in. It does not excuse what happened before by any stretch of the imagination. That's why they're paying more than $100 million. But we take that as a good sign that they're trying to turn the page and do right by consumers here in Washington State.
Yes, and the standout to me is the fact that there was an intentional cover-up that goes with it.
Absolutely, and this went on for more than a year. And keep in mind, an intentional cover-up that had the potential to harm thousands and thousands of Washingtonians. I mean, that is not okay, and it's why we have strong laws and why we have an office there in general to enforce those laws on behalf of the people. So we're really pleased with this outcome. We think it's the right outcome, but obviously we'll be monitoring Uber as things go forward.